understand how modern governance systems around the world evolved over the years, particularly the forces that shaped the kind of governance systems that we find in the world. They did not occur as accidents, but they were forces behind their occurrence. So our discussion is to focus on these forces and then see how modern governance systems were either shaped or benefited from these forces. We need to observe that at some point in human history, people lived in small bands in the villages. And these villages were headed by patriarchs or matriarchs. And that was before the establishment of modern states and governance systems. People had a feeling that they belonged to particular families, and therefore all their needs and desires were met by families, even if not sufficiently. But they believed that the immediate needs, families and clans where they belonged to, could adequately cater for their needs. And again, it's also important to observe that much of the production system then was largely subsistence. And what mattered then was meeting the immediate needs of the families. That is, the need for food, the need for shelter, and the need for clothing. There was nothing beyond the production of items for purposes of sale or for commercial purposes. Again, there was no bother because the needs were quite limited. People never bothered to understand what was happening beyond their villages. Their world was quite narrow, and therefore their concern were about issues that affected them at the immediate level. Their understanding was that what they had is what God had given them, and they were not bothered whether they were attacked by external forces, and even if such attacks were there, they had no reason why such attacks were there, and who exactly could be responsible, and what the motive of such attacks could be. This is because their world was quite narrow. And this state of affairs existed until around 1400. So that when we talk of modern governance systems as we see today, it is roughly about 600 years old, because it's around 1400 that now the turning point in terms of governance systems that we see today merged. So we want to look at some of the forces that contributed to this. One of the forces was the institution of patriarchy. We know, for instance, that a lot of communities, a lot of families, we had men who took charge of families. And some of these men were so much powerful because of polygamous marriages, they had large families, and because of that, people looked up to them for purposes of protection and for purposes of provision of certain needs. So the patriarch, that is the most powerful man with large family, who was wealthy, was seen as the one that stood a better chance of protecting other members of the clan or other members of clustered families. In that case, therefore, the patriarchy was now the source and the authority of governance that existed at that time. Through marriage again, the families expanded and they gave birth to households, and with several households put together, they constituted a clan. Then a group of clans constituted a tribe. Confederations of various tribes formed one commonwealth, which now later on was called a state. The male child carried on the population through marriages with one or several women, because both monogamy and polygamy were practiced. So this is basically understanding that the origin of modern governance systems as we know it today has more to do with the institutional patriarchy. That is, the men married and several families formed a clan. These several clans formed a household, rather several families formed a household, and several households formed a clan. Then several clans contributed to a tribe, and several tribes contributed to a confederation. And it's a confederation of these tribes that now gave birth to what was then called a commonwealth. And then a commonwealth now later gave birth to the modern state and governance as we see it. So this theory of this understanding is simply telling us the institution of the males in the community contributed significantly to the governance system that we find today. Indeed, when you look at it deeply, most of the functions that modern governance systems carry out, such as maintenance of law and order, discipline, and others, have traditionally been done by the men. It is the men that provide the defense. It is the men that punish people who have gravely offended the community, and therefore, what modern systems do today has actually been done by the institutional patriarchy. And this is why we attribute modern governance systems to the institution of patriarchy. Another important element that has also contributed to modern government systems is the issue of commerce and industry. And we need to notice that economic activities prior to industrial revolution consisted of subsistence production. And I think that's one I had made observation earlier. And even so, there was still need for a form of governance for the effective coordination, because different people were doing different activities. And these activities needed some form of coordination. And this coordination now implied some element of governance. Now, subsistence production gave birth to merchants. Merchants were large-scale traders who traversed different geographical sites while carrying out their businesses. And again, industries also developed. What began as cottage and small-scale industries over time grew and became large industries. So the emergence of merchants and large industries required uniformly treated population as their pool of laborers and markets of a unitary governance system. In other words, we needed a system of governance to put together a population, because merchants and industrialists, they needed this population to serve as labor, to provide labor in the industries and the trade. And again, the labor that was provided also, other than labor provision, the population was so necessary in terms of providing markets for goods and services that were being traded or produced by industries. It's also important also to observe that the commerce and industry also need a formal organization in the form of modern government system to develop and enforce uniform laws and devise means of transport to facilitate the movement of goods from the source to the markets. Indeed, we needed roads. These roads needed security. We also needed laws that regulate trade, among other things. And to do so, the idea of modern governance became quite paramount, because you needed a central authority that could enact laws and enforce laws. We also needed a central authority to provide utilities such as transportation, security, and others, so that commerce and industrial activities could be carried out not only in a coordinated manner, but also in an orderly and peaceful environment. But commerce and industry also provided a modern governance system with hardware, technology, and ease of communication to effectively and efficiently manage the large population under state jurisdiction. It is important to notice that states or governance systems also needed some form of taxes, and through such taxes, they could now provide the much needed services that traders and industrialists needed to carry out their activities. Things like provision of energy to power industries, roads to transport raw materials to industries, and also to transport finished products to the market. You needed the police to man the roads so that bandits or highway robbers do not interfere with the flow of trade and the flow of industrial activities. So in that sense, therefore, there was need for states or governance to come up. And governance therefore needed some form of revenue to enable them provide these services that commerce and industry needed to prosper. And this required now the coordination. So the presence of population as it is, and because this was working, it offered government opportunity to now tax them. And through taxes, government was then therefore able to provide services that commerce and industry needed to power its activities. One other important aspect that also had a great influence is the influence of the Greeks, the Greek community. We know, for instance, that much of modern intellectual and governance practices began in Greeks, especially the Athenian Greeks. These were the first people to produce some of the most notable great philosophers, such as Aristotle, Plato, Holmes, and others. And these people were concerned about the question of justice and human governance and how the two would influence the political community. Plato, for instance, in his book The Republic, describes a utopian political community in which good, gifted people are selected at infants to be the leaders, or what he called the guardians, and are carefully trained so that they will be able to rule wisely and autocratically. In other words, Plato understood governance as a form of socialization, that it's a practice that virtues of governance begins at a tender age, and therefore individuals were meant to be selected at a tender age, and then as they grow, as they mature, they are trained and prepared to be the leaders. And in doing so, according to him, they need to rule in a wise manner, but also in an autocratic manner. In other words, it was, according to Plato, he believed that wise people make decisions that are good, and therefore, because the decisions are good, it should be imposed on individuals or on the subjects without further questioning. But Aristotle also agreed that the best constitution would be one in which a single selfless person or a few selfless people, what he called aristocracy, ruled. In other words, he felt that if we can get selfless individuals, people who do not think of themselves but think of others, if one person can be found, then that one person should be the one that rule over others. But because that's not possible, he felt that we can then pick a few selfless people, what he called few wise men who are selfless, in his political theory that he called, or that is later on became known as aristocracy. But he also noted that because people or man is naturally selfish, then everybody should be given an opportunity to rule in what he called democracy. But he also concluded that selfish rule by a single person is worse than selfish rule by many people. And therefore, he rooted for a rule by many people as the best form of leadership. So the ideas of the Greek philosophers also help a lot in terms of shaping what the kind of governance that we see today. So that when you talk of autocracy as a system of governance, you talk of democracy as a system of governance, you talk of representation as a system of governance, much of it can be traced to the ideas of the Greek philosophers, notably Plato and Aristotle. Another important influence or force that shaped modern governance systems as we understand it today is the Christian Church. And those who subscribe to this view opine that system of governance came into existence through the effort of God rather than man. That is the question of justice, the question of the rule of law, the question of order as we understand it in form of what governance is, according to this school of thought, is much to do with the will of God rather than the will of man. And therefore, the king, who was the custodian of governance system, was not only an agent of God on earth, but also derives his authority from God. In other words, kings believed that the idea that they rule over others is not in themselves, but one that's ordained to them by God. Therefore, by ruling others, they're basically fulfilling the will of God on others. And the king was therefore responsible only to God for all his actions, and obedience to the king was ordained to God, and violation of it was considered as a sin. Because they felt that the authority to live, or the authority to govern others, is given to them by God, then they were not responsible to their subjects, but rather to God, who is the one that gave them the authority to lead. They also believed that disobeying them does not simply mean disobeying them. It means disobeying the person who instructed them to lead over others. And this person, according to them, is God. So when you disobey the kings as the custodians of governance, according to this theory, it amounts to disobeying God. And disobedience of God is considered a sin. The king was above law, and no one under his authority could question his authority or his actions, since he was responsible only to God. Again, I emphasize that according to this school of thought, the governance which was coordinated and centralized at the kingdom, according to the kings, that governance was given to them by God. And therefore, the ordinary laws that other subjects were subjected to, the king was not subjected to, since they were above the law. And the only law that they were under is God himself. Now, this system of governance existed at a time in history when religion and politics were combined in the person of the king, so that kings borrowed much of their authorities from the church, and the church also supported them. But I think over time, churches felt that kings were taking instructions and applying them in a manner that the Bible and other godly teachings did not prescribe. And over time, churches began to question the authority of the king and the manner in which they were ruling over others. And I think at the time that kings' authority to lead over others became challenged, beginning with the one in England, and then it spread to other areas. So that even if we have kings today, they do not have powers as much as the ancient kings. Another important force that also shaped the way governments or the way governance today is carried out are the scholars. The idea of scholars, especially philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Their contributions shaped a lot the way modern governance is carried out. The social contract view, which was proposed by Thomas Hobbes, observed that people live together in society in accordance with an agreement that establishes moral and political rules for behavior. In other words, those who govern and the ones that are governed, they have a contract. They have a contract. And those who govern, they act according to the contract that they have signed with the governing. In other words, they were saying that governance is about contract, a contract that is signed between the governor and the governed, so that anything that goes outside that, it means that the contract has been violated, and therefore that relationship between the governor and the governed needs to be revoked because the contract is no longer in force. And some people believe that if we live according to a social contract, we can live morally by our own choice and not because a divine being requires it. In other words, if both sets, the governor and the governed, both lived according to the core provisions of the contract, then that is a moral life. And that kind of choice is a good one because it has the ability to prosper humanity. Therefore, modern governance system came to existence out of a contract between the subjects and the rulers, and that men create government for the purpose of securing their natural rights. Human beings have natural rights. Now, these rights need to be enjoyed in an atmosphere that has peace, that has the rule of law, and that has order. And that can only happen when there is a government in place. And this government is therefore created by people to enforce law and order and create a peaceful environment so that man is able to enjoy the natural rights that are given to him or her by God. Later on, Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, argued that all people are selfish, and in the absence of authority, they will turn against each other and live in a life full of poverty, solitary, nastiness, and lower life expectancy. People are selfish, and because of that, there will be disorder. And because of that disorder, there will be fights, there will be violence, there will be death. And in that situation, people will become poor, they will live lonely lives, they will become nasty, and they will die much earlier. Now, to prevent all this, there is need for an institution, for a system that ensures that there is order, to restrain selfishness, and to ensure that people do not become poor, do not lead solitary lives, they do not become nasty, and they also do not, or rather they live longer. Through that, therefore, there was need for a governance system. So people naturally allowed themselves and created institutions that now ensure that there is order, and that order prevents selfish individuals from engaging in activities or acting in a manner that undermines the rights and opportunities that others may have. So that is how, according to Thomas Hobbes, the idea of modern governance system sprang. So that is the ideas that have been provided by the scholars. One more thing is the issue of colonialism. Colonialism also gave birth to modern practices, modern governance practices as we see them today. And we understand colonialism as a practice in which one state or group exerts control over another territory and its inhabitants. This system was characterized by political dominance, occupation by settlers, and economic exploitation. It may also entail replacement or restructuring indigenous governance systems with foreign governance systems. Colonial governance system often remains in effect in areas so many years even after independence. Of course, as we see today, much of the governance system that we practice in Africa and other developing countries is borrowed from colonialism. The kind of state system, the kind of parliamentary system, the kind of judiciary, much of it is borrowed from colonialism. So colonialism also shaped the way modern systems worked. Lastly, is the issue of global conflicts. The most notable global conflicts that has been experienced in the history of man is the one of the World War I and World War II. And this was, for instance, World War II led to the deaths of an estimated 70 to 25 billion people. And World War I led to the deaths of an estimated 15 to 22 billion people. And again, alongside that, there were about 9 to 10 million military personnel who also perished in the wars. Now, this, because of the devastating wars, the consequence of war, and a body called the United Nations was established to lead in modern governance and to ensure that issues that led to World War I and World War II do not recur again. The primary goal of the UN was to maintain international peace and security, provide humanitarian assistance to those in need, protect human rights, and uphold international law. Indeed, from time to time, the UN and other international organizations, they set up bodies. They set up rules, they set up protocols, they set up governance structures and standards, and in which member states are required to ratify and then practice them in their own countries. So because of that, there are several standards, governance instruments that you find in most countries and whose origin are traceable to the United Nations. This, therefore, makes United Nations, whose birth was the result of the two global conflicts, as also an important force that has contributed to the governance practices that we see and practice in many countries around the globe. That becomes the end of our discussion. Take note of any issue that's not clear and raise it at appropriate time so that we can explore it further. Thank you so much for your time.